ran through these. Let's bring this question up right here. This is interesting. I want to hear what everybody's answer is to this. I've been thinking, trying to think back in my old age. It's hard to go back that far. But Martin asked, "Do you remember your first woodwork project? What was it?
I do.
Do you?"
I do. Yep. Um, I was Martin was I was married at the time, and she went and bought some crosses from Hobby Lobby so we could paint them, and then we were giving them as gifts. But then the next time everybody liked them, so we were going to make some. We went back to Hobby Lobby, and I saw how much they cost, and I'm like, I've never touched a, I've never done anything with a piece of wood before, but I bet I can do it cheaper than that. And so we went, and I didn't know what I was doing. I bought a scroll saw, and we bought a sheet of plywood. That was the most crookedest cutting piece of crap. I didn't know it was doing what it was supposed to be doing. But so I ended up buying a small bandsaw from the hardware store and got through a couple of them, and then we made a bunch of them, and that's what started the whole thing off, was making those crosses. Never did anything with wood or any kind of crafts like that before, and just because Hobby Lobby was gouging us, man.
There you go.
so, so mine, before I did something at home, mine was back in grade school, and it was during shop class or ag class. Down here, it's ag class is what we call it, and just like Leah said that we'd always build something to put in the fair, even though some of us like had animal projects that we'd show, but we'd also put something in. It was like kind of the homemaking, but it was all kind of tied together. But I built a barbecue pit, but I had to put a board. Most barbecue pits have some sort of cutting board or a board where you can place stuff. And that's kind of what got me. That was the first time I've ever used a router and a saw. They had everything in there. They didn't have a whole lot of woodworking stuff. They had the common stuff like table saw, skill saw, routers, and but I made the board and I routed in on the top was the logo or basically the name or the initials of the person I built the pit for. So it was actually the ag teacher's husband that purchased all the material, and I built the pit, and then I put that board, and that's kind of like what got me hooked in. Was the first time I used that, and then from there, years later, I got back into it, and I built the first thing I built at the house at my old shop was the most hideous table you've ever seen out of pallet wood, because back then it was like pallet wood was the thing. I look back at it. I mean, it was cool. Everybody loved it, but I look back at it now and I'm like, oh my God, that nothing was even exposed
rustic,
screw holes.
Joey, it's rustic.
But yeah, that's what it was. It was a rustic table. I mean, I remember we did all this and finished it, and then we started slapping it with chains to put marks on it. That's what they wanted. Yeah. Yeah.
I suppose you sanded it down with round sandpaper as well, did you?
Of course.
Yeah.
That's all we do here in the US is round sandpaper.
Mm-hmm.
But
So
that was
my
go ahead.
Go ahead,
sorry,
Jen.
were you still your story, Joey?
No, not no more, Jen. Go ahead. You're the
Okay.
movie star.
My first one really was a house sign for my dad. I had started doing stuff on the lathe, and he took that as woodworking, and so he wanted a number sign for his vacation place. And I was like, well, I can't do that on the lathe. So I went out and I bought a scroll saw, thinking, well, I could just scroll out some numbers real quick. This is going to be easy. So yard sale, here I come. Bought a little used scroll saw, and it has now cost me thousands of dollars later. But he did eventually get his house number sign, and then turned around and sold the house, so that $1,000 sign is still
was the
sitting
selling
on
point
somebody
right there.
else's vacation home.
That was the
That-
selling point.
That's funny you say that. Till today, you can ask my wife. That was the worst mistake she ever made. Was ask me. She found something on Pinterest and said, "Can you make this?"
Sure
And I was
can.
like, "Well, sure I can, but I'm going to need some tools."
exactly.
Yep.
And that's where it started. And she's like, "Why did I ever ask
Yeah.
you?" Because she knows. I mean, it's just the way it is. Got to have some tools. And then from
Yeah.
there, it's progressed
Mhm.
into
You start one thing and you're like, oh, I could do this if I just had this, and oh, I could do that.
but I got real good
Mhm.
at it. I got real good at it. How
Course.
to break it and ask. Well, just not ask, but tell. But yes, ask. I'm not
This
gonna lie.
project's
She's
gonna
probably
need this
watching,
tool.
So you're gonna hear later.
but
So
it's
I get
so
Mhm.
she'd be like, "What? So what do you need now?" Well, if I had this, I can't really get this done, but if I had this, it would make
Mhm.
it so much easier.
Hmm.
And you just kind of that deal. But yeah, go ahead, Matt.
So my first projects were, you know, um, home renovation, stuff of that nature, but it was always supervised. So my first unsupervised project was speaker boxes. So I just dove right in and was doing angles and figuring out air and airflow and uh, doing all that stuff. That was my very first, and I had to buy a table saw and a jigsaw and uh, gluing and screwing and yeah. So that was my very first out of MDF and then wrapping it in carpet. So
That was a real big hit early 90s, late
mhm.
80s, but really
Early
mid
90s.
90s, early 90s, mid 90s, because that's what a lot of people were doing in ag shop too. Everybody was putting sound systems in their trucks,
Yep.
Mhm.
tearing things apart, making speaker boxes.
Oh
All the
yeah.
welding and metal fabrication stopped. It was a speaker box
Mhm.
shop there.
Oh yeah.
So for me, I mean, I was making stuff out of wood when I was really really young. But the problem with that is nothing ever came. And I had a little shed in the backyard. But the problem with that is nothing ever made it past the firing bin into the house. Um, so when I actually made something that I was actually getting requests, I was making like little name plaques and things like that. But the very very first one I ever made, I made a Scottish Terrier with a name Jinx on it on the scroll saw, and it was all painted black, and that was for one of my mum's friends. That was the very first thing I was ever asked to make on the scroll saw.
Nice.